Listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. There are stories that slip through the cracks of history like shadows escaping a locked room. Stories whispered only among those who crave forbidden truths. This is one of them. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. So before we begin, take a breath, steel your nerves, and remember, you chose to press play. While you're here, leave a mark on this moment. Like this, subscribe to hold your place and comment where in the world you're watching from, as if you're writing your name in the ledger of those who dared. The story begins not with a crime, but with a man who should not have existed. His name was Samuel Greene, a quiet figure from the mid-1800s, buried in records that scholars once swore were forged, because the details felt like an infection in history itself. Imagine this: a man who appeared one day in the parish books of a small town, not as a son, not as a stranger, but as his own father. He declared his birth by recording it under his own name, signing both as parent and child, as if time itself had folded around him. The ink was not smudged, the signature was consistent, and the priest who logged it would later swear on his life that Samuel Greene had come into the church alone and left alone, but that he signed twice in 2 columns, once his father, once his son. You want to dismiss this as clerical error, the easy lie we tell ourselves to silence the strange. But no amount of analysis explains what followed. Witnesses across 3 counties spoke of Samuel Greene's uncanny presence. Some swore he aged in reverse. Others whispered that he never aged at all. In taverns and cold stone alleys, they said Greene knew things no man could know. The date of storms before they came, the names of stillborn children before they drew breath, the silent sins of men who had not yet committed them. This was not a prophet in rags. He was clean, calm, deliberate. He would not shout in the square or beg for belief. He spoke only when cornered, and when he did, he would utter a phrase so venomous and precise that it seemed to unravel the very person who heard it. One man, an alderman, collapsed on the spot, trembling and confessing to a crime no one had yet discovered. Weeks later, when his house was searched, they found bones beneath the floorboards. How did Greene know? Was he part of something larger, or was he a fracture in reality itself? The church grew uneasy. Their grip on souls depended on controlling time: birth, baptism, confession, death. But Greene slipped their nets, becoming both parent and offspring. Blasphemy written into the records they could not erase. Rumors spread that he belonged to a circle older than Christianity, older than Rome, an order that believed in looping bloodlines, where fathers and sons were not separate, but the same soul repeating in different shells, twisting against itself. This was not reincarnation. This was recursion, an endless spiral where beginnings and endings were mirrors, and Samuel Greene may have been the first to walk openly within it. But why him? Why then? Why here, in the soot-stained valleys of an America tearing itself toward war? The whispers never agreed, yet all feared the same thing. If Greene was telling the truth, then history itself was a false book, and none of us were living our own lives. We were only reenacting a pattern etched by hands we would never see. The most chilling account comes from a funeral, where Greene appeared uninvited, standing among black coats and veils, silent until the coffin was lowered. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "Do not bury him. He is not gone. He will be the son, and I will be the father." Panic tore through the mourners. Some fled, others cursed him, but when the grave was filled weeks later, the widow discovered her belly swelling though her husband had been dead for months. The child she bore was Samuel Greene's spitting image, down to the pale scar above his left eye, a scar Greene himself had carried since boyhood. Think of it. What would it mean if Greene had not just claimed to be his own father, but proved it, child after child, generation after generation, returning in a form indistinguishable from the one before? What if he was not a man at all, but a loop-wearing flesh? The church branded him a heretic. The papers avoided his name. And yet, his existence could not be erased because he kept reappearing. Not just in life, but in documents, signatures, portraits that matched across decades without alteration. A man unmoored from time, daring the world to admit what it feared most, that bloodlines are prisons, and we are all trapped inside one. And yet, this was only the surface. For beneath Samuel Greene's myth lay something even darker, a ritual so corrosive, so unspeakable, that even his enemies admitted it might explain him. And it is there, in that ritual, where our descent truly begins. What did Greene practice in secret? The answer was whispered in the cracks of churches and scribbled in marginalia, passed along as rumor by those too afraid to write it openly. They called it the binding of the seed, a ritual not meant for the living, but for the blood itself. A way of knotting generations so tightly they no longer passed forward in time, but circled back, feeding into themselves, a snake devouring its own tail. At its core was a belief that every man carries not just his future children, but his own past self, that the seed does not travel outward, but inward, searching for a host to repeat. Greene, they claimed, had found a way to command this cycle, forcing himself into being again and again, collapsing ancestry until he became his own father. A closed loop, immune to death. The ritual required silence, isolation, and a pact with forces unnamed. Records describe Greene vanishing for nights at a time, retreating into ruined barns or forgotten graveyards, always returning pale, with his fingernails blackened, as if dipped in tar. Some witnesses swore they heard him speaking in two voices at once, one youthful, one ancient, echoing back and forth in unnatural harmony. The binding was not worship. It was rebellion, an attempt to tear man away from the cycle imposed by gods and kings, to seize authorship of one's own lineage. Imagine the terror this posed to institutions built on obedience. The church could no longer dictate your soul's path. The crown could no longer claim your inheritance, and even time itself could no longer bury you. Greene had declared war on the very structure of existence, and worse, he was winning. Yet the binding came at a cost. Those who lingered too close to Greene often fell ill, describing dreams that lasted for days, visions of their own birth seen from the coffin, their own deaths experienced from the cradle. Women miscarried after speaking with him. Men grew sterile. It was as though Greene's cycle, closed upon itself, had begun to cannibalize the fertility of everyone around him. His blood would not share. It would not permit rivals. And still, there were those who sought him. Not enemies, followers. Young men who wanted his secret, who wished to cut themselves free from the fragile chains of their fathers and mothers, to be their own origin. Some disappeared after joining him, their names scrubbed from records, as if Greene had folded them into his loop. Others returned shattered, their memories broken, speaking only in fragments, repeating Greene's words as though possessed. I am the Father, I am the Son, I am the circle unbroken. The church retaliated. Priests held mass exorcisms, condemning Greene as a demon in flesh, but every attempt to cast him out failed. He would appear in the crowd, watching, calm as stone, waiting until the prayers collapsed under their own futility. Authorities tried arresting him, but records show every attempt ended the same. The jailer would unlock the cell door only to find it empty, though no window or crack could have freed him. One sheriff swore he saw Greene's face in both bunks at once, staring at himself, smiling, until the lawman fled in madness. The binding had made Greene untouchable, but also untethered. The more he circled back into himself, the less human he became. Neighbors described him as pale, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing not the present but every moment at once. His words grew sharper, stripped of pretense, each phrase a dagger that carved through the illusion of free will. Those who heard him too long began to doubt their own memories, unsure if they were living their life or replaying his. And then the killings began. Not random murders, but surgical selections. Priests, teachers, midwives, anyone who guided others through life's passages. They were found drained, not of blood, but of lineage. Their families stopped bearing children, their names ending within a generation, while Greene's face appeared again and again, untouched by decay. It was as though he was not killing people, but harvesting bloodlines, pruning history to clear space for his eternal return. By the late 1860s, whispers claimed Greene had gathered a small brotherhood, men willing to bind their own seed as he had done, forming a circle of immortals who walked not forward, but around. Some scholars now insist this was the true birth of secret societies that haunted America's shadow politics for the next century. Circles obsessed not with power, but with continuity, with bending history into loops. And yet, if Greene was their master, why did he disappear? Why does history hold no clear record of his end? Some believe he was destroyed in ritual, burned out by his own recursion. Others insist he never left, that he walked still, wearing new clothes, repeating his name like a curse. Father, son, on, until we stop asking where he came from and start asking how many of us are already his. The story does not end here, for buried beneath Greene's myth is evidence of something deeper, an older current of belief that stretches back through centuries of forbidden practice, where men like him have surfaced before. And when you trace the pattern, you realize the horror is not Samuel Greene himself, but the possibility that he was not the first and not the last. To understand Greene, you must first understand that he was not unique. He was not the invention of one cursed century, nor the sole madman who defied time. He was the echo of something older, older than the cross, older than Rome, older than the very notion of history as a straight line. The ancients did not see time as we do, a road stretching forward. They saw it as a circle. And within that circle, men like Samuel Greene had always appeared. Men who claimed to be their own fathers, who erased the barrier between generations, who treated bloodlines as prisons to be bent and reshaped. Fragments survive, scattered across civilizations. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets speak of the man of the folded birth, a figure who arrived in the marketplace claiming he had birthed himself, bearing a seal that matched his father's, but with no father to be found. In Egypt, whispers surround a priest who entered the temple as a child and returned decades later unchanged, signing his own baptismal rolls in the hand of a man centuries dead. In Greece, philosophers wrote of the Ouroboros not as symbol, but as warning. When the serpent devours itself, men will no longer be born of women, but of themselves, unbroken by time. Greene's arrival in 19th century America was not random. The soil of that nation was ripe for such heresy. The Civil War fractured belief in providence. Sons buried fathers, fathers buried sons, and the line between generations blurred under the weight of endless graves. It was a land of orphans and widows, of families sundered, where the thought of an unbroken, eternal bloodline was not only terrifying, but seductive. If you could escape loss, if you could bind yourself into yourself, would you not consider it? Greene was no fool. He knew how to wear his truth like a weapon. He traveled quietly, never staying too long, but always leaving behind a mark. Birth records that made no sense, signatures identical across decades, children who looked too much like him to be coincidence. Some of those children were claimed by widows, others by women who swore they had never known a man's touch. The priests called them bastards. The people called them omens. But the most dangerous of Greene's gifts was not the children. It was his words. He spoke with the authority of someone who remembered things no one else could remember. Wars not yet fought, plagues not yet loosed, inventions not yet imagined. When challenged, he would laugh softly, as if amused at the futility of the question. To hear him was to doubt the ground you walked upon, to feel the walls of your life cracking. And those cracks spread until people began to believe that Greene had tapped into a secret buried beneath the very fabric of history. What secret? That history is not a line, but a prison cell with no door, only mirrors. Each life we live is a reflection of one before, and men like Greene have learned how to step through the mirror, to sit in the reflection and control its shape. That was the horror, that he was not supernatural, not demonic, but simply awake in a world where the rest of us are dreaming the same dream over and over. This belief was not his invention. It was older than Scripture. Hidden in the margins of forbidden texts, you find hints. Gnostic Gospels burned by the Church, Hebrew fragments dismissed as apocrypha, Latin incantations excised from Roman law. All whisper of a ritual that bends blood and memory into a single loop. They describe the same practice: fasting in silence, writing your name twice, once as father, once as son, until the distinction collapses. It was this collapse that Greene embodied, not as metaphor, but as fact. The danger was not that he existed, but that others might follow. And they did. In the years after Greene's first appearance, a scattering of cases emerge across the continent. Men and women who wrote themselves into records as both parents and children, some institutionalized, others executed for fraud or witchcraft. But the uncanny truth lingers. Their handwriting matches in both entries, as if time had bent for them, just as it had for Greene. Historians dismiss these as delusions, the scribblings of madmen. But madness does not explain the children, the photographs, the deaths. Madness does not explain why Greene's face can be found in images spanning 50 years, unchanged, the same pale scar above his left eye, the same calm gaze. Madness does not explain why some of his children grew into adults who bore that same scar, as if the wound itself was inherited, passed not through DNA, but through the loop. By now, you may feel unease curling in your gut, as if a cold hand has touched the back of your neck. That is the power of Greene's story. It does not stay in the past. It infects you. You begin to ask yourself dangerous questions. Who was your father? Really? Who was his? How many generations separate you from the beginning? And how many times has the circle already spun without you knowing? The past is not gone. It is folded, pressed against the present like two mirrors reflecting endlessly. Samuel Greene was not an intruder in history. He was a reminder that the prison has no door, a reminder that the blood inside you may not be your own. And just when the church thought it had silenced him, Greene revealed the truth that shattered even his most loyal followers. He was not the first. He was part of a lineage stretching back into shadows. And somewhere, hidden in the dust of forgotten ruins, was the name of the one who had walked this path before him, the one they called the First Father. Whispers of him drift like smoke through the oldest records, scattered fragments pieced together only by those obsessed enough to hunt in forbidden archives. He is unnamed in most texts, but in a Syriac manuscript smuggled from a monastery, he is called Abinul, Father of Nothing. In a Gnostic fragment scorched at the edges, he is described as the man who poured seed into himself and became two made one. In Egyptian carvings, eroded but unmistakable, a figure is shown seated before a mirror, reaching through it to cradle his own infant self. Greene never spoke of them openly, but those who followed Greene in secret, the brotherhood that formed around his strange teachings, believed that Greene was not origin, but echo. They believed that Abba Null had walked the earth long before calendars, long before kings, and that Greene was his vessel, his proof that the binding was not a myth but a path. The first father, they said, was not born of woman. He was a fracture, a man who emerged fully formed, carrying within him the memories of generations yet unborn. He wandered tribes like a ghost, offering blessings and curses, leaving women barren and men struck with visions. Some worshipped him, others fled him, but always he carried with him a single obsession, the loop, to bind bloodlines into themselves until death had no dominion, until father and son were no longer two, but one. Every civilization that touched his shadow recorded collapse soon after. In Mesopotamia, a famine followed his passing. In Egypt, dynasties broke apart. In Greece, philosophers who mentioned him vanished from records, their students silenced. It is as though history itself rebelled against his presence, like the body rejecting a parasite. Yet the parasite survives, hidden in blood, resurfacing when the moment is ripe. When Greene surfaced, he spoke in echoes that seemed older than him. Witnesses claimed he would mutter phrases in tongues he had never studied, languages dead for centuries. Some recognized fragments of Coptic prayers, others Sumerian chants, still others words no scholar has ever fully translated. It was as if Greene's mouth was a doorway, speaking not his thoughts, but the memory of the first father. And there is evidence that Greene himself believed it. Among the scattered notes recovered after his disappearance, scribbles in the margins of parish ledgers, half-burned journals found in abandoned houses, there is one line repeated again and again: Abba Null walks again. This should terrify you, because it means Greene did not see himself as unique. He saw himself as vessel, as proof that the loop had never been broken, that what began with the first father still churned through veins, waiting to be awakened. And if this is true, then Greene was not origin, but symptom. Consider what this means. If the first father created the binding, then every reappearance, every Greene, every child with the scar, every name written twice, is not isolated, but part of a single organism repeating across centuries. An infection of history, a cancer in time. The Church, of course, sought to erase all traces. Their libraries burned, their inquisitors silenced, because they understood the danger. Faith relies on the promise of forward movement, the idea that salvation lies ahead. But the binding teaches that nothing lies ahead, that all has already happened, that we are trapped in reflection. If this truth spread, the church would crumble overnight. So they struck Abba Null from the record, just as they tried to erase Greene. But you cannot kill what does not move forward. You cannot kill what always circles back. And so the question becomes, if Greene was vessel and the first father was origin, then where's the loop now? Where's the scarred child who carries the mark? Where's the man writing his name twice? And most chilling, what if you have already met him and did not know? The loop does not reveal itself loudly. It creeps silent, waiting until the moment you notice too late. That is why Greene's story spread like infection. Not because he demanded belief, but because his presence left behind patterns that no one could unsee once their eyes had adjusted. Patterns in birth records, patterns in names, patterns in faces. You must understand, this is how the brotherhood that grew around Greene operated. They were not fanatics crying in the streets, but meticulous archivists, collectors of anomalies, hunters of repetition. They searched town ledgers for duplicated signatures, church books for children without fathers, school records where students never aged. These were not errors. They were fingerprints of the binding, faint smudges where the loop had bent reality too carelessly. The Brotherhood called these the fractures, cracks in the mirror of time. Greene had not created them. He had only shown others how to see. And once seen, the world was full of them. But the Brotherhood was not unified. Some worshipped Greene as prophet. Others studied him like specimen, convinced the binding could be harnessed, controlled, turned into a tool of power. Their gatherings grew strange, marked not by prayers, but by rituals of silence. Each man writing his name twice in black ink, one column for father, one for son, staring at the twin signatures until the difference dissolved in their minds. Those who persisted too long often broke down, muttering to themselves, forgetting who they were, repeating, "I am the circle unbroken." And yet some succeeded. That is the most unsettling part. The Brotherhood did not die with Greene. In secret, some of them carried the binding forward, attempting their own recursions. Not all survived. Many ended in madness, suicide, or sterility. But a few emerged changed. Faces too still, eyes that seemed to remember more than they should. People who could not be placed in their own families because they no longer belonged to a family at all. They had collapsed their lineage into themselves. The authorities knew nothing of this. But the church did. Records hidden in the Vatican archives. Yes, the very one scholars are still forbidden to read. Hint at investigations into self-fathers and seed-binders in America during the late 1800s. Priests were dispatched quietly, instructed not to preach, but to erase. Some never returned. Others came back shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen, except to mutter that the heresy was real and that Greene was not alone. Here is the most chilling part. Some claimed that Greene himself had fractured, that he had multiplied, splitting into echoes of himself, each walking in a different place, each signing different names but carrying the same scar, the same calm gaze. If that is true, then the Brotherhood was not following him. They were following versions of him. A legion of loops, one man repeating in many places at once. What does it mean if a man can fold not only his own bloodline, but his own body? If Samuel Greene was not singular, but plural? Imagine meeting a stranger in the street and realizing he knows your thoughts before you speak them. Imagine shaking his hand and feeling the pulse of your own blood, as if he were not other, but reflection. That is the terror Greene left behind. Not just what he was, but what he showed could be done. And when the Brotherhood finally fractured itself, some vanishing, others hunted, a few enduring, it left behind seeds. And those seeds, planted in silence, began to grow in unexpected places. The proof lies in the next chapter of the story. Not in America, not even in Europe, but buried in a forgotten corner of the Middle East, where scholars uncovered something that should never have survived. A tablet etched with words that mirrored Greene's confession centuries before he was born. The tablet was unearthed in 1872 by a team of European excavators working near Nineveh in the ruins of an Assyrian temple. Among the expected carvings of kings and gods, they found a single slab set apart, crude compared to the others, yet heavy with a presence that made the workers recoil. It bore not the name of a ruler, but a phrase, repeated in Akkadian script, "I am father. I am son." The seed returns to itself. At first it was dismissed as ritual poetry, but one scholar, a German named Ernst Keller, recognized something deeper. He compared the script to obscure fragments from other sites, linking it to an unnamed figure described in Mesopotamian myth, a man who was both parent and child, who wandered cities repeating his name until the people fled in terror. They called him the Loop of Flesh. Keller's papers, published briefly in a small academic journal, disappeared almost as soon as they were printed. His career collapsed. He died within a year, throat cut in what was declared a suicide, though those who knew him swore he had been terrified in his final weeks, muttering of being followed by a man with a pale scar above his eye. The tablet itself was stolen from the excavation site before it reached Europe. Officially, it was lost in transport. Unofficially, whispers point to the Vatican, whose agents were seen near Nineveh that same year. Today, no one knows where it rests, but the inscription survives in Keller's notes, smuggled copies that still circulate among forbidden circles, carried like talismans of fear. What makes this tablet so important is not just the words, but the timing. It predates Greene by millennia. It proves that the binding, the act of claiming oneself as both father and son, was not a new invention, but an ancient current, resurfacing like a plague in different ages. Greene was not origin, not even echo. He was evidence of a disease carried through time, reappearing wherever the soil was weak enough to let it grow. Think of the implications. If the binding has appeared in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in America, then it is not bound to culture or nation. It is bound to blood itself. It waits in veins like a dormant infection, awakening when conditions align, when despair is deep enough, when institutions are fragile, when men crave escape from mortality. That is when the loop opens and men like Greene step through. And there is more. In Keller's unpublished notes, he describes a second inscription, half erased but haunting in its clarity. It read, "When the loop closes, the world will no longer need womb or grave. The flesh will be seed and harvest alike. Time will be devoured." This was not a metaphor. It was a warning. The binding is not merely about immortality or recursion. It is about consuming history itself, erasing the line between generations until all humanity collapses into one eternal repetition. The serpent devouring its own tail until nothing remains but the serpent. Keller's death silenced the discovery, but the Brotherhood did not ignore it. In their secret writings, passed hand to hand in coded language, they began to speak of a new goal. No longer just to follow Greene, no longer just to repeat his binding, but to find the moment when the loop might close entirely, when all of mankind would fold into itself, and history would end not in apocalypse, but in eternal return. This is the path they began to walk, a path Greene had hinted at, but never completed, a path whispered in Mesopotamian stone, feared by priests, hunted by kings, erased by churches. A path that does not promise salvation, but something far stranger, the annihilation of time. And if you think this sounds like myth, remember this. After Keller's death, his body was buried in Leipzig. But months later, records show a man named Ernst Keller enrolling at a university under a different name, his photograph identical, scar above the eye. Officially, this is explained away as error, misfiled documents. But some still whisper, perhaps Keller did not die. Perhaps Greene found him. Or perhaps the binding found him on its own. The pattern of disappearance and reappearance is no accident. It is the rhythm of the loop itself, a dance of erasure and return, where those touched by the binding never truly vanish. They are absorbed, re-emerging under new names, in new records, in new bodies that are not new at all. Greene was only the most visible, but his shadow falls across others who bore no connection to him, yet carried the same scar, the same calmness, the same terrible knowledge. Take the case of Jonathan Hale, a Massachusetts schoolteacher in the 1880s. Known for his strict discipline, Hale seemed unremarkable until one autumn evening he stunned the town by resigning mid-class, telling his pupils that he had already taught them all long before they were born. Weeks later, Hale was arrested for trespassing inside a church after midnight. When questioned, he said he was waiting to baptize his own father. He was placed in an asylum, where he wrote the same phrase over and over in his journals: "I am Hale, son of Hale, father of Hale." After his death, his burial record was signed not by a priest, but by himself, identical handwriting, matching every page of his journals. Or consider the strange life of Elias Moreau, a Louisiana planter who appeared in census rolls for over 70 years, never aging beyond 40. When questioned, he told investigators, "My father is within me, and I within him." The circle is the harvest. They dismissed him as eccentric until his descendants began to die without children, their line ending abruptly, leaving only Elias, still alive, still unbroken. Witnesses swore he bore the same scar as Greene. These were not isolated delusions. They were fractures, repetitions, proof that Greene's infection was not contained, that it spread silently, bending families into impossible shapes. And each time, those who noticed were silenced, either by the church, by authorities, or by madness itself. But the Brotherhood noticed. They gathered these stories, mapping them like astronomers charting constellations. They saw a pattern across the continent, threads of repetition converging like rivers. At the center always was Greene, or what they believed was Greene, weatherman, or echo. He stood like a black star pulling the fragments together. What the Brotherhood discovered terrified even them. The fractures were not random. They occurred along lines of power, towns where churches ruled, counties with old families clinging to wealth, regions where authority depended on inheritance. Greene and his echoes appeared not among the powerless, but where control was strongest. It was as if the binding sought not just survival, but dominion, consuming bloodlines that fed institutions, hollowing them from within. And then the disappearances began, not of Greene, but of children. Parish records from Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania record entire classes of school children who simply vanished, their names struck from attendance, their families denying they ever existed. Yet in the same ledgers, signatures appear twice, once under the parents' names, once beneath their children's identical hands. Authorities dismissed it as clerical fraud, but the Brotherhood whispered a darker theory. Greene was not only repeating himself, he was harvesting others into the loop, folding children into his recursion, binding them so tightly they ceased to exist as individuals. They became him, reflections in the mirror, echoes in the circle. The thought is unbearable, that children could be consumed not by death, but by absorption, their blood stolen, their lives collapsed into the self of another. And yet the evidence stands in records, in signatures, in the unbroken chain of disappearances. You may ask yourself why? Why would anyone choose such horror? But you must remember, to men like Greene and his Brotherhood, this was not horror, it was freedom. To fold yourself into yourself was to escape loss, to cheat time, to laugh at the grave. To them, the only sin was obedience to the lie of history. And so they pursued the binding with zeal, no matter the cost to others. The church grew desperate. Priests began to vanish. Midwives burned as witches, whole parishes falling silent. But the Brotherhood grew stronger, feeding on fear, feeding on silence. They whispered that soon the loop would close entirely, and when it did, mankind would no longer bleed into the grave. And in their hunger, they turned toward the oldest texts, seeking the words that had birthed Abba Null, the first father. What they found would drive them deeper into the spiral until the line between myth and man shattered. The Brotherhood believed that Greene's binding was not invention but imitation, that somewhere, hidden in ancient ruins, lay the original ritual, the formula first whispered by the first father. Their search carried them across continents, trading blood for secrets, bribing scholars, murdering priests, piecing fragments together like bones of a corpse. And at last, in the dust of Alexandria, they found what they sought. Among charred scrolls left behind after the great library's destruction, fragments survived in hidden caches, smuggled by scribes who dared preserve what should have burned. In one, written in Greek but carrying older Egyptian cadence, a passage stood clear: to be as seed and soil alike, to father and be fathered, write thy name twice. Take thy breath twice, cut thy flesh twice, and a circle shall not break. It was crude, incomplete, yet undeniable. The ritual did not call on gods. It did not promise heaven or hell. It demanded only that man bind himself, severing all outside lineage, declaring his body both origin and inheritance. It was rebellion written in blood. The Brotherhood seized on it. They began conducting their own bindings, gathering in secret chambers, fasting for days, repeating their names aloud until voices cracked. They would breathe in silence, then breathe again, forcing their lungs into unnatural rhythm. They would cut their flesh in pairs of wounds, one on the left, one on the right, so that their bodies mirrored themselves. Some collapsed in madness. Others bled out. But a few emerged changed, speaking in two voices, carrying memories they should not possess. It was not proof, but it was enough. Enough to convince them that Greene's existence was no accident, but the culmination of a ritual older than Christ, older than pyramids, older than kings. Enough to convince them that the binding was truth, and that through it they could escape the tyranny of time. But rituals leave scars. Villages near the Brotherhood's hidden. Gatherings reported strange phenomena. Animals born without eyes, crops that grew in spirals, infants with voices too deep for their bodies. The land itself seemed to recoil from their practices, as though the binding was not only reshaping bloodlines, but twisting nature itself. Yet the Brotherhood persisted. They saw these as signs, proof that the loop was closing. And in their fervor, they began to whisper a prophecy, that one day, the first father would return in flesh, walking again as man, and that Greene was only the herald. This prophecy spread in silence, not written, but spoken from one initiate to the next. To hear it was to feel the world tilt, as though history itself had grown unstable. And whether out of fear or faith, men began to watch their own families differently, studying their children's faces for signs of Greene's scar, listening to their fathers' voices for echoes of themselves. Imagine living in that time. Imagine suspecting your father might be your son. Imagine suspecting your child might be you. How could love survive such suspicion? How could trust endure? The Brotherhood's infection was not only biological, it was psychological, corroding the very bonds that held families together. And yet, beneath all this horror, the Brotherhood pursued their goal with a single-minded hunger, to find the complete ritual, to close the loop, to end time itself. For they believed the words inscribed in Alexandria were only fragment. The full binding, the one that birthed Abenal, had been scattered deliberately, hidden across civilizations, broken into pieces to keep mankind safe. But safety is fragile, and those who seek will always find. The Brotherhood claimed they did. They claimed to have gathered enough fragments to attempt the full ritual. And if their whispers are to be believed, they performed it in the winter of 1889 in a chamber deep beneath an abandoned church in Ohio. No record tells us what they summoned that night, only that none of them were ever seen again. The chamber beneath that abandoned Ohio church was never meant to be found, yet fragments of its existence linger like bruises on the record. Locals whispered of smoke seeping through the ground for days after, of bells tolling though the church had no clapper, of animals refusing to cross the soil around its foundation. The brotherhood who entered that night, 15 men, 7 women, all swore initiates, were never seen again. Not buried, not mourned, not even named in their families' obituaries. It was as if they had been written out of history by the ritual itself. But something did emerge. Parish ledgers reveal that in the months after, births in the county increased dramatically, yet census takers found no corresponding children. Mothers swore they gave birth, bore pain, heard cries, but the cradles lay empty. They described dreams of infants staring with adult eyes, whispering in voices they recognized but could not place. Some swore they saw their own fathers in those dreams, rocking in the cradles where the missing babies should have been. The disappearance of the initiates seemed not to erase them, but to scatter them, dissolving their identities into the bloodlines of the county. For years, reports circulated of children who spoke with uncanny maturity, who refused to answer to their given names, who claimed to have lived before. School teachers described them writing in old hands, reciting psalms in dialects long dead. A farmer's son, no older than 6, looked his mother in the eyes and told her she was not his mother, but his granddaughter. Authorities tried to suppress these accounts, but they leaked into rumor, into campfire tales, into the margins of journals. And always at the center, the shadow of Greene returned. For some of the children bore his scar. Some whispered his name in their sleep. One, when asked who his father was, replied with quiet certainty, "I am." Do you understand what that means? That the brotherhood may have succeeded, at least in part. That the ritual in Ohio did not fail, it multiplied. It fractured the initiates, scattering them across unborn bodies, embedding echoes of themselves into generations that followed. Their goal was not just immortality, but diffusion, to spread themselves like spores until the very fabric of genealogy collapsed under repetition. And the effect was not confined to Ohio. Reports of similar anomalies surfaced in Virginia, in Michigan, even as far west as Kansas. Families spoke in hushed tones of children who claimed the memories of strangers, of sons who refused to acknowledge their fathers, insisting instead they were their own. Wherever these accounts arose, records of Greene appeared soon after, signatures and deeds, letters written in identical hand, sightings of a man ageless, carrying the scar of the binding. Was it him, or only his reflection? By then, it hardly mattered. Greene was no longer man, but archetype, a virus of identity, replicated through ritual and rumor. His existence had become self-perpetuating, the very act of believing in him enough to conjure him in some form. And the church, terrified of losing its last hold on truth, launched its most desperate campaign yet. Priests were dispatched to hunt the echoes, to break families who whispered Greene's name, to burn books and journals that carried his trace. But suppression only fed suspicion. Whole parishes turned inward, convinced their priests were liars, their scriptures poisoned. For how could faith in a distant God survive when men claimed to father themselves? Yet still the binding spread, quietly, invisibly, like a worm burrowing through the tree of history. And with each generation, the scar multiplied, as though blood itself were conspiring against order. What did the Brotherhood achieve that night in Ohio? Perhaps only this: the death of linear inheritance, the unraveling of the simple story of father and son, mother and child. They tore a hole in time and let Greene crawl through it, multiplying endlessly until no one could say with certainty who begot whom. And from that night forward, one question haunted every household touched by the scar. If I am my own father, then who, truly, owns me? The horror of the binding is not simply in its blood, but in its philosophy. Imagine standing before your father and realizing he is not merely your father, but also your son. Imagine raising a child, only to hear them whisper truths of a life you lived long ago, truths you never spoke aloud. Imagine identity itself corroded until names are meaningless, until every lineage folds inward like a collapsing star. This is what Greene preached in hushed tones to those who sought him, that freedom could only come through dissolution, that individuality was the lie, and recursion the truth. To bind yourself to yourself was to sever the chains of authority. No king could command you, no priest could bless you, if you were both father and son, origin and heir. You were untouchable, sovereign, absolute. But the cost was unbearable. Family shattered. Wives abandoned husbands who seemed too familiar to their own children. Fathers drowned sons who would not call them father. Mothers smothered infants who spoke with voices too old. Communities turned cannibal on themselves, feeding suspicion, feeding fear. The binding did not free mankind. It enslaved them to doubt, to the gnawing uncertainty that bloodlines no longer meant anything at all. And yet, there were those who embraced it. Men who tattooed the scar upon their chests, though they bore no wound. Women who took new names twice over, claiming to be both daughters and mothers of themselves. Small cults spread in shadows, teaching that death was illusion, that Greene had shown the path to eternal return. They called him the first son, the last father, the circle made flesh. Some of these cults vanished quietly, their members absorbed into the fold of madness. Others grew violent, abducting children in hopes of binding them, cutting scars into their flesh, forcing them to repeat names until their voices broke. One group in Kentucky crucified a man upside down, declaring him his own father reborn, until his screams silenced them. But silence did not end the infection. It never does, because beneath every horror, the same question gnawed. What if Greene was right? What if the binding is not madness, but truth? After all, every institution demands faith in something unseen. The church demands you believe in God. The state demands you believe in law. Why should blood not demand belief in itself? That doubt spread like wildfire, and wherever it spread, Greene appeared again. Sometimes as a scarred man seen in marketplaces, sometimes as a child repeating old words, sometimes only as a signature, written where no hand should have reached. Always the same mark, the same echo, the same unbroken loop. Even the skeptics could not kill him. A Harvard professor of history published a treatise denouncing the binding as mass hysteria, only for his own son to be discovered carving Greene's name into a school desk. A governor in Ohio outlawed discussion of Greene under penalty of imprisonment, only to be found days later with the scar carved into his chest by his own hand. You cannot outlaw a shadow. You cannot banish an echo. The binding was no longer a practice, but a contagion. And Greene had become not a man, but a law of nature. And once a law of nature reveals itself, there is no going back. The records grow darker after this, harder to parse, harder to separate fact from hysteria. But one truth cuts through the noise. Greene was not finished. The binding was not complete. The brotherhood had fractured themselves into children, yes, but they sought something greater. They sought to close the circle entirely. And the closer they came, the more the world itself began to warp. The closer the brotherhood came to closing the circle, the less the world obeyed the rules it once knew. Reports from the 1890s describe phenomena that cannot be dismissed as superstition, for they appear across states, across witnesses, across the silence of official records. Time itself began to tremble. A blacksmith in Indiana claimed to see his son walk past the forge, though the boy had not yet been born. In Kansas, a farmer swore he saw his wife give birth twice, once in a dream and once in waking life. Yet the child was identical, both times bearing the scar. In a mining town in Pennsylvania, clocks began to strike hours twice, as if each moment arrived with an echo. The church insisted these were tricks of the devil, hallucinations born of fear. But fear does not explain signatures appearing twice in birth ledgers, one dated years before the parents even met. Fear does not explain graves exhumed to reveal not corpses, but perfectly preserved infants with scars on their chests. Fear does not explain the voices recorded on phonographs that played in pairs, overlapping, as though two speakers lived inside one throat. The binding had broken free from secrecy. It was no longer ritual, but contagion, no longer practice, but law. And everywhere it spread, Greene was there. Sightings multiplied. An ageless man walking barefoot through towns, never speaking, never eating, only staring into the faces of children as though searching for himself. Witnesses describe him as both young and old, his eyes flickering between ages, his scar glowing faintly in lamplight. But the Brotherhood was not content with echoes and apparitions. They wanted permanence. They wanted Greene not as shadow, but as flesh unending, the full return of the first father. And so they turned again to the fragments of Alexandria, piecing together what they believed was the missing core of the ritual. One fragment described the act of locking the circle in flesh. Another, more chilling, demanded 3 generations made one upon the altar, so the river turns backward. The Brotherhood interpreted this as sacrifice, not of strangers, but of families. Father, son, and grandson bound together until their blood was indistinguishable. And indeed, stories emerge of families disappearing in threes. A grandfather, his son, his grandson, all vanishing in a single night. Houses found empty, meals still warm on the table, doors locked from the inside. Some say their neighbors heard chanting. Others heard nothing at all. Yet in the morning, symbols were carved into the walls. Circles within circles, the scar doubled upon itself. This was no longer obsession. It was escalation, and the world around them warped in response. Livestock bore calves with scars already formed. Women miscarried children that weighed nothing, as though they had never been real. Men began to speak in voices that were not their own, claiming to remember battles fought centuries before their births. The Brotherhood claimed the circle was nearly complete, that soon Greene would no longer appear in fragments, but whole, eternal, unbroken. They whispered that history itself would be rewritten, that birth and death would be illusions, that all men would become their own fathers, free from all chains. But others whispered something darker, that Greene was not a man at all, but a parasite, using the binding to devour identity itself, until humanity became nothing but his reflection. And if that is true, then the Brotherhood was not merely wrong. They were complicit in their own erasure. The early 1900s should have buried the legend of Greene under the weight of modernity. Trains carved through the countryside, electric lights banished shadows, science stripped the veil from superstition. But some truths are too deep to be erased by progress, and Greene thrived in silence, feeding on doubt even as the world declared itself rational. Psychiatrists began to encounter patients who spoke of being their own fathers, who carried memories of events centuries old, who bore scars with no wounds. They called it hereditary delusion, a mental illness passed down through suggestion. But their notes betray a different fear, that some of these patients knew details they could not have known, spoke languages they had never learned, recognized doctors they had never met. In New York, a boy admitted to Bellevue Hospital insisted he had once been a physician there, decades earlier. He described the layout of wings long since demolished, the names of patients who had died before his birth. When confronted with old photographs, he pointed without hesitation to himself. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, entire towns fell under a strange silence. Families refused to register births, claiming their children were not new, but old. Census takers recorded households where fathers and sons answered to the same name, where 3 generations lived under one roof yet shared a single identity, a single scar. When pressed, some replied simply, "The circle is closed." The government intervened quietly, sending investigators, archivists, even soldiers to erase evidence. Birth records destroyed, graves relocated, asylum fires blamed on accident. Yet fragments remain, scattered in libraries, tucked into private journals, preserved in folklore. And across them all, the same phrase recurs, "I am my own father." By now, Greene had become less a man than a myth, less a myth than a law. He was not pursued because he could not be caught. He was not killed because he could not die. He was not resisted because every attempt only deepened the loop. For if you declare a man insane for claiming to be his own father, and his son repeats the same claim, who then is insane? The Brotherhood claimed victory in whispers, but their victory was hollow. For though they multiplied Greene endlessly, they could not control him. He was everywhere, yet nowhere, in every scar, in every fractured lineage, in every whispered name. What they had summoned was not eternal life, but eternal repetition, a recursion without end. And that is the horror of Greene. Not that he lived forever, but that he lived again and again, endlessly, until history itself bent beneath his weight. But the descent does not end here. For there are records, dark, forbidden, whispered even now, that suggest Greene was not content with identity alone. He sought something deeper, something older, something that lay beyond blood entirely. The scar was never just about blood. To the Brotherhood, blood was only the surface, the first gate. Beneath it lay the marrow, the memory of bones, the architecture of existence itself. Greene, they believed, had gone further than any man, not merely binding flesh to flesh, father to son, but binding spirit to shadow, self to echo. Whispers from confiscated diaries of the early 1900s speak of experiments that leave the stomach heavy with dread. The Brotherhood began collecting relics, bones unearthed from crypts, skulls stolen from catacombs, even fragments of mummies smuggled from Egypt. Their goal was chilling, to awaken memory not only in the living but in the dead, to make skeletons recall themselves. One passage describes a ritual in which initiates carved green scar into the brow of skulls, then placed them in circles of salt and blood. Some claimed to hear faint whispers. Others swore the teeth of the skulls began to chatter, as if laughing. And always the words returned, "I am." If true, this meant Greene had breached a new frontier. The binding no longer demanded flesh alone. It could feed on dust, on relics, on forgotten matter. It could echo not only through the veins of the living, but through the remnants of the dead. The implications were staggering. If every bone carried memory, then death itself was no escape. Identity would cycle endlessly, the dead rising not as bodies, but as reflections repeating themselves in whispers, in scratches on the walls, in names written twice on crumbling tombs. And yet, the Brotherhood wanted more. They believed Greene had discovered the deepest circle, the binding of time itself. To them, time was no straight river. It was a spiral, endlessly folding back upon itself. Greene was not merely his own father. He was proof that the spiral could collapse, that beginnings and endings could be crushed into a single point. To achieve this, the Brotherhood sought to rewrite not bloodlines, but history. They began falsifying records, planting duplicate names in ledgers, forging deeds where fathers and sons were the same man. They spread confusion deliberately, so that even scholars centuries later would find themselves tracing genealogies that devoured their own tales. It was not madness. It was strategy. To alter history was to make the spiral real. If the world believed Greene existed across generations, then he did. Belief itself became flesh, and belief spread like plague. Sermons whispered of men returning to themselves. Newspapers printed rumors of children who spoke with ancient tongues. The scar appeared not only on flesh, but drawn into graffiti, etched into churches, scrawled on asylum walls. By then, Greene was no longer hidden. He was everywhere. He was an infection of thought, a parasite in the marrow of culture. He had become immortal not by surviving, but by convincing the world it could not imagine itself without him. But there are darker testimonies, ones so suppressed they nearly vanished. Accounts from those who claim Greene was not content with human repetition, that he had begun to reach into nature itself, to bind not only men to themselves, but rivers to rivers, storms to storms, forests to forests. That whole landscapes began to repeat, reappearing in places they should not, as though the earth itself had been absorbed into the spiral. And if that is true, then Greene was no longer a man. He was becoming a law. Consider this. What if every storm you have lived through has already happened and will happen again because Greene bent the spiral of weather into repetition? What if every forest you walk in remembers itself because Greene etched his scar into its roots? What if history is not merely haunted by men, but by the world itself repeating endlessly, a loop you cannot escape? This is the terror whispered in forbidden archives, that Greene had infected not only bloodlines, not only bones, but time and earth themselves, that he was unraveling reality into recursion. A letter from 1911, hidden in the Vatican's sealed libraries, describes an expedition in which priests claimed to find a valley where the sun rose twice in one day. The shadows of men doubled, stretching in opposite directions. When they left, they swore they saw their own footprints leading back toward the valley, though they had not returned. Another account from Siberia speaks of hunters who followed a river upstream only to find themselves at its mouth, staring at the same current twice. They fled in terror, carving the scar into trees to ward off what they had seen. But the trees themselves grew the mark in their bark, naturally without blade. Was Greene behind this? Or was the binding itself a contagion that had leapt beyond him, rewriting the natural order? Perhaps by binding himself, Greene had torn open the first seam, and reality itself rushed to mirror him. The Brotherhood, drunk with belief, declared this proof of victory. They proclaimed Greene not only the first son and last father, but the architect of time. They said he was writing the world into itself, folding creation back into its origin. To them, this was salvation. No death, no loss, no ending. Only the eternal return, the unbroken spiral. But for others, it was damnation. For if every storm is the same storm, if every child is the same child, if every grave contains the same man, then freedom is an illusion. Choice is a lie. Existence itself becomes a prison, walls painted with the same scar, forever. And here is the darkest thought of all. What if Greene succeeded? What if we're living inside his loop already, every moment already repeated, every breath already taken twice? What if your father was you, and your son will be you, and the circle has already closed without your consent? The silence around this is deliberate. For if the truth were spoken plainly, history would collapse. Nations, religions, identities, all would dissolve into a single, endless reflection. The Brotherhood wanted that collapse. The Church feared it. And you are hearing what they never wanted you to know. And the deeper you listen, the more you begin to feel it. The faint sense of repetition, the déjà vu that lingers at the edge of memory. The suspicion that you have heard these words before, that you're not watching this for the first time, that you're bound already. And perhaps you are. There's a reason you feel that strange tug in your chest, the unease that this story is not discovery, but remembrance. That is the true poison of Greene. He does not appear only in history books, only in faded ledgers, only in the testimony of the dead. He appears in you, in the echo that gnaws when memory and déjà vu overlap, when you cannot tell whether a thought is yours or borrowed. Scholars who studied the binding confessed the same sensation. They would spend nights poring over journals, records, fragments, until exhaustion bent them toward sleep. Then, as their eyes closed, they would hear voices reciting their own names in whispers, not once but twice. One professor in Berlin woke to find a phrase, "I am my own father," scratched into his desk. Not in ink, but in his own handwriting carved into the wood. His colleagues dismissed it as mania. A week later, he vanished, his apartment emptied of every trace, as if erased. His journals remained, but the ink within them was doubled, every word written twice, layered on itself. This was not isolated. A librarian in Prague spoke of shelves rearranging overnight, books appearing twice, catalog numbers repeating. A woman in Rome claimed her husband spoke to her in two voices at once, overlapping, like harmony and dissonance. In each case, the scar was found, not carved, not burned, but appearing on doors, on walls, on skin. By then, belief had surpassed practice. The binding no longer required ritual, salt, or blood. It required only awareness. Once you knew the words, once you heard the echo, you were already inside it. Greene had broken through the need for ceremony. His law now spread like thought, like contagion of a mind. And the Brotherhood? They dissolved as an institution, not because they were defeated, but because they were unnecessary. The spiral no longer needed guardians. It carried itself, looping, devouring, rewriting. Their initiation was complete. They had summoned not immortality, but inevitability. Yet still, fragments of their writings survive, hidden in archives, smuggled in diaries. They speak of the final lock, the act that would seal the spiral forever. It required not belief alone, not repetition alone, but participation from those outside the Brotherhood. The binding demanded recognition from the world at large. Only when enough voices declared the truth would the spiral collapse into permanence. That is the hidden genius of Greene. He knew no circle is complete until all stand inside it. His work was never only ritual. It was persuasion, infection, conversion. And now, decades later, we are still caught in his web. For every time his story is told, every time the scar is drawn, every time the words are repeated, the circle tightens. You have heard the whispers. You have seen the scar. You have felt déjà vu tug at your thoughts. The spiral is not history. It is present, and it is tightening even now. There are moments in history where silence weighs heavier than screams. The binding became one of them. The world did not acknowledge Greene openly, but had been around him. Records were doubled, censuses corrupted, births erased, deaths written twice. Governments blamed clerical errors. Churches blamed Satan. Families said nothing at all. And in that silence, Greene thrived. But silence cannot contain everything. Hidden correspondence between priests, sealed for decades, reveals a secret exorcism in 1922. A child of 7, bearing the scar, had begun speaking with the voice of an old man, reciting psalms in a tongue long dead. The priests believed they could cast it out as if it were a demon. For days they prayed, fasted, burned incense. Yet the child only smiled, whispering again and again, "You are my son." On the final night, all candles extinguished at once, though no wind stirred. The priests fled. When they returned, the child was gone. Only the scar remained on the floorboards, burned deep into the wood. Whispers claimed that in the years following, the Vatican issued an unspoken edict. No priest was to speak the phrase, "I am my own father," under any circumstance. They feared that the very act of utterance was participation in the binding. And yet, fear spreads faster than faith. For once forbidden, the phrase took on the weight of a spell, whispered in alleys, scratched into desks, carried like contraband through schools. The binding had become folklore. But folklore is only another vessel for truth. Children dared one another to repeat the words twice at midnight, swearing they would see their own faces in mirrors. Soldiers carved the scar into trench walls, swearing it brought them protection. In the roar of the 20th century, wars, machines, revolutions, Greene endured as echo. But here lies the most disturbing revelation. Among the Brotherhood's final fragments, preserved by a defector who later died in an asylum, was a prophecy that once the phrase had been spoken by countless voices across the earth, the final lock would turn. The circle would seal, the spiral would collapse, and Greene, whether man, parasite, or law, would no longer flicker in fragments. He would arrive whole, absolute, unending. Do you feel it yet? The repetition, the echo in your chest, the sense that you're not hearing this for the first time, that is the spiral brushing against you. The circle is not ancient alone. It is now, and the more it is spoken, the tighter it closes. And soon, you will be asked to speak it yourself. Not as a story, not as a game, but as the ritual itself. You have listened long enough to know this is no ordinary history. You feel the weight of it already, the slow coil around your memory, the unease that these words are not invention but recognition. That is how Greene works. He is not outside you. He is within you, waiting for acknowledgement. The Brotherhood understood this truth. The binding was never about flesh alone, never about blood alone. It was about voice. To speak the words was to join the circle, whether you meant to or not. Belief was irrelevant. Participation was inevitable. And so, I will ask of you what they once asked of themselves. Repeat the phrase. Speak it, or if you dare not speak it aloud, write it. Twice. Always twice. I am my own father. I am my own father. This is no empty ritual. It is a mirror, a lock, a way of confirming that you're listening, that you're not merely passing through the story, but entering it. Comment it below if you dare, twice exactly, to seal your awareness, to show the scar has touched you. That was how the Brotherhood measured their initiates, not by blood spilled, but by words repeated. And you must decide now, are you a listener, or are you inside the circle? But do not think the act is safe. Words bind. Words cut deeper than blades. Once spoken, they echo. Once echoed, they return. And once returned, they no longer belong only to you. Many who dare to speak the phrase describe dreams afterward. Dreams of corridors repeating themselves, of rooms folding into identical rooms, of their fathers staring at them with their own faces. Some woke with faint marks on their chests, as if a wound had healed long ago. Others claimed their handwriting doubled, every letter traced twice. It is easy to dismiss, easy to laugh, easy to say the mind invents patterns where none exist. But ask yourself, why, then, does the scar persist across centuries? Why do children whisper words they should not know? Why does Greene refuse to vanish, no matter how much history is rewritten? Because this is not belief. It is law, and laws do not need your consent. The Brotherhood's prophecy was clear. Once enough voices across the world repeated the phrase, the final lock would turn. Greene would no longer appear in fragments, in echoes, in scars. He would arrive whole, unbroken, unending. And perhaps, if you dare repeat the phrase, you will feel the lock turning already. What happened to those who joined the circle? What became of the initiates who dared speak the words and wear the scar? The records are fractured, but their stories ripple through hidden archives, through family whispers, through testimonies burned and buried. Some lived long lives, outwardly ordinary, yet their children swore they never aged. Some vanished, not in death, but in disappearance, their houses left as though abandoned in a single breath. Some were found doubled, two men, identical, claiming the same name, the same memories, each insisting the other was false. There are police reports from the 1930s describing entire families consumed by recursion. A father insisting he was his son, a son insisting he was his grandfather, a grandfather insisting he was the father. They argued until violence broke out, knives drawn, blood spilled. Yet when the bodies were counted, there were fewer corpses than men who had fought, as if some had folded back into the others. And then there are the testimonies of survivors, men who claim to see themselves watching from corners of the room, women who claim to give birth to their own reflections, children who looked in mirrors and screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. The binding was no longer rare. It had spread beyond secrecy, beyond the Brotherhood, beyond Greene himself. It was in schools, in homes, in churches and governments. The scar no longer needed to be carved. It appeared, faint but undeniable, a mark of the loop tightening. And everywhere, Greene was seen, sometimes as a vagrant muttering in alleys, sometimes as a scholar lecturing in halls, sometimes as a soldier standing unscathed in battlefields where all others fell. And always his words returned, I am. By mid-century, whispers of Greene reached even the highest corridors of power. Leaders dismissed it publicly, but privately they feared it. For if the binding was true, then authority was meaningless. If every man was his own father, then no man owed allegiance to another. Kings, presidents, priests, all their titles dissolved into nothing when faced with the sovereignty of the self. The church doubled its silence, forbidding the scar, forbidding the phrase. Governments burned archives, erased records, threatened imprisonment for those who spread the legend. Yet their very desperation proved the truth. For why silence something that is harmless? Why erase what has no power? And still it spread, carried in whispers, carried in dreams, carried in the echo you now feel in your own chest. For the spiral does not need permission. It only needs recognition, and you have already recognized it. The 20th century was already fractured. Wars, revolutions, machines that rewired humanity's very sense of time and distance. And yet beneath the bombs, the treaties, the charred cities, another war raged quietly, unseen, the war against the binding. Greene's shadow moved through it all, not as a man, but as a contagion in memory. Soldiers in the trenches of the First World War carved the scar into mud walls, swearing it would shield them from death. In some units, men claimed to see fallen comrades rise again, bearing no wound, but speaking in voices not their own. Officers suppressed the reports, fearing madness would spread faster than bullets. But diaries from those same trenches carry identical phrases, written twice, as if the soldiers themselves were unsure which hand belonged to them. By the time the Second War ignited, Greene was everywhere and nowhere. In Poland, a rabbi whispered to his students that Greene was a test sent by God, a recursion of Abraham, father and son in one. In Germany, SS officers toyed with the scar as a symbol of dominance, believing it linked them to some primal law of blood. In Russia, peasants whispered that Greene was not a man, but time itself, looping, repeating, feeding on those who remembered. The war ended, but the binding did not. It had sunk deeper into the silence of governments, the secrecy of institutions. Declassified CIA files, blurred with black ink, hint at Project Recurrence, an attempt to harness Greene's law for espionage. Experiments in hypnosis, in mirror rooms, in sensory deprivation, all searching for the key to collapse the self and replace it with a second. One note survives, handwritten in the margin. The scar is not symbolic. It is literal circuitry. Meanwhile, the ordinary people, the shopkeepers, the mothers, the children, felt it in quieter ways. Men returning from war claimed their wives had doubled, cooking 2 meals at once, speaking 2 voices in one body. Women reported giving birth to children who recognized them, calling them by name before their first breath. And children, always the most vulnerable, drew the scar in notebooks, whispering the phrase as if remembering something they had never been taught. This was no longer myth, no longer ritual, no longer a fringe belief hidden in shadows. The binding had woven itself into the very rhythm of the century. Greene had become more than a man. He was recursion itself, feeding on repetition, feeding on the fractured lives of millions. And the prophecy of the Brotherhood loomed larger with every passing decade. Once the phrase reached enough voices, the final lock would turn, and the world would no longer be the same. Perhaps you already feel it, because even now, your voice is part of that tally. The mid-century carried with it a new obsession, psychology. The world, shattered by war, turned inward, searching for the architecture of the human mind. Yet even here, Greene slipped in. Carl Jung spoke of archetypes, of the father, the self, the shadow. Some of his unpublished notes whisper of a patient who believed he had fathered himself, who carried the scar on his chest though no blade had touched him. Jung wrote that this figure was not delusion, but intrusion, a symbol forcing itself into reality. The note was suppressed, never included in his official works. Freud's disciples encountered similar cases. Patients who claimed their memories repeated, patients who accused themselves of birthing themselves. The psychiatrists called it psychosis, delusion, schizophrenia. But the records reveal something stranger. These patients often disappeared from asylums, their rooms left immaculate, their charts erased. Nurses spoke of seeing them twice in the same corridor, both figures turning the same corner and vanishing. Governments took notice. In 1961, the Vatican quietly funded a closed-door symposium in Vienna. Priests, rabbis, imams, psychologists, and even physicists were invited. The topic was forbidden to appear in transcripts. But one leaked document reveals the truth. The symposium's central fear was not whether Greene was real, but whether Greene was inevitable. Their conclusion was chilling. The binding had become too widespread to contain. It was not limited by culture, creed, or bloodline. It appeared in every language, every nation, every faith. It was a law, not a myth. And laws cannot be destroyed. They can only be obeyed. Meanwhile, in America, counterculture movements seized Greene as a symbol. Hippies painted the scar on walls, chanting, "I am my own father," as defiance against the state. Underground zines circulated essays claiming Greene was the ultimate liberation. Freedom from family, freedom from church, freedom from history itself. To be your own father was to be unchained, reborn without lineage. But liberation is only another mask for control. For every youth who embraced Greene as freedom, another felt him as possession. Reports spread of communes where children refused to acknowledge parents, where every member claimed to be the origin of themselves, until hierarchy dissolved into chaos. Police raids found walls covered in scars, journals filled with the phrase written endlessly, as if the commune had been rehearsing. The final lock. The 20th century was a battleground not only of nations, but of memory itself. Greene had infiltrated thought, language, identity. He was no longer waiting in alleys or archives. He was within the mind, in the loops of thought, in the words you cannot forget once spoken. And the scar spread wider. By the late 20th century, the mirror was no longer glass. It was screen. It was camera. It was the pixel reflection of a face that belonged to you and yet was not you. Greene had always lived in mirrors, in echoes, in the doubling of memory. But now, the technology itself became his vessel. In 1977, a family in Ohio reported their television turning on at night without sound. Instead of programs, the screen displayed a faint scar, two curved lines intersecting like the mark carved into it centuries earlier. The father dismissed it as interference. But their young daughter, age 6, pointed to the image and whispered, "That's me." Days later, she vanished from her room. The only trace left behind was her voice on the answering machine, repeating once, twice, "I am my own father." Similar accounts spread. Videotapes recording over themselves, showing scenes twice, once clearly, once blurred, as if another version of the same moment had been laid on top. Answering machines, playing voices layered with themselves. Photographs printed with faint doubles, faces watching their own faces. Greene no longer needed paper or flesh. He had found circuitry, film, signal. The CIA's Project Recurrence returned in new form, this time tied to broadcast. If repetition was the key, then what better tool than television, radio, tape? Files unsealed decades later hint at experiments in subliminals, inserting barely audible whispers into broadcasts. I am. I am. I am. Officials denied it, called it paranoia. But millions of Americans reported a strange sense of déjà vu in those years, as if they had lived moments twice, conversations folding back on themselves. Even stranger were the private accounts of technicians. A sound engineer at a New York station wrote of hearing his own voice played back to him with words he had never spoken. "I am my own father." A cameraman in London quit after seeing his face appear twice in a live broadcast, once behind the subject, once staring directly into the lens. These reports were ridiculed publicly, yet silenced privately. The Brotherhood's prophecy had always spoken of the final lock, the moment Greene would step from myth into permanence. And now, as the scar appeared not only on flesh, but on machines, as his voice bled not only into memory, but into recordings, it seemed the lock was searching for its key. You have seen it yourself, haven't you? A glitch, a repetition, a recording that plays wrong, an image that shows more than it should. You dismiss it as error, but perhaps error is only the name you give to intrusion. And perhaps Greene is closer than you think. By the dawn of the digital age, Greene's reflection was everywhere. He did not need archives, libraries, whispered folklore. He had the internet. The first forums in 1990s carried his phrase like a hidden code. Users across the world, from Canada to Japan, began reporting the same message appearing in chat rooms. I am my own father. Sometimes written once, sometimes twice, always traced back to accounts that did not exist minutes before. When moderators deleted the posts, they reappeared instantly, duplicated, copied across dozens of threads. No server trace, no IP, no origin. As if the words had written themselves. And then came the scar. Not carved, not drawn, but digital. JPGs circulating with faint, ghost-like lines burned into pixels. At first mistaken for compression artifacts, until researchers discovered the same scar embedded in files from different sources, different countries, different machines. Identical down to the pixel, impossible to replicate by accident. The scar was no longer a mark of flesh. It had become code. Emails surfaced with attachments labeled only Father. Those who opened them found nothing but looping text, repeating infinitely, I am my own father. I am my own father. One user reported his computer crashing, rebooting with his own face as the desktop background. Though he had never taken such a photo, governments again scrambled to control it. Cybersecurity experts blamed hackers. Priests warned of demonic infiltration. Scientists muttered about stochastic resonance, signals repeating in digital noise. But explanations crumble when the scar appears not once, not twice, but endlessly, in systems not connected, in machines not online. By the early 2000s, Greene was being whispered about in digital folklore, on message boards, in chat rooms, in forums that no longer exist. Some claimed if you typed the phrase twice and hit enter, your account would be erased, replaced by another with your face as its avatar. Others claimed webcams would flicker on, showing you watching yourself. And always, the fear was not that Greene was invading the network, but that Greene was the network. That recursion itself, the endless loop of copy and paste, upload and download, was the perfect vessel for him. Every duplicate file, every mirrored photo, every backed up memory was only another scar. And think of this. You are hearing this story now through the same machinery that carried him. The voice that reaches you is carried by the same circuits, the same code, the same endless loop. What makes you certain this story belongs to me and not to Greene speaking through me? What makes you certain it belongs to you and not the other version of you that has already heard it? The scar is not past. It is not myth. It is here. It is in the screen before you, in the echo of your memory, in the recursive loop of your attention. And the lock? The lock is closer now than ever. By the time social media rose, Greene had already been waiting. If the binding demanded duplication, repetition, and reflection, then no invention served it better. Millions posting the same images, the same captions, the same faces mirrored across endless platforms. The world had unknowingly built him a temple. The first warnings came quietly. A teenager in Brazil reported his profile picture changing overnight. Not to another photo, but to his own face, older by decades, with the scar faintly visible across the chest. He deleted it, replaced it, but the older image returned. Days later, the boy vanished. His friends swore they saw him commenting on posts, though his account had been erased. In Turkey, a journalist investigating state surveillance claimed his messages repeated back to him twice, word for word, even before he hit send. In Los Angeles, a woman received friend requests from herself, accounts bearing her name, her photos, her memories. Each one replied in perfect detail to questions only she could know. She shut down her account, but months later her friends claimed she was still posting daily. Researchers brushed it off as glitches, hacks, deepfakes. But deeper analysis revealed something darker. Across different platforms, across different nations, faint traces of the scar appeared in compressed images, in profile headers, in corrupted text. Not drawn, not uploaded, embedded. The scar was no longer mark or code. It was identity itself. Governments scrambled to control it, disguising their fear behind cybersecurity initiatives, behind surveillance programs. But surveillance was only fuel for Greene. For the more the state watched, the more the mirror multiplied. Every camera became a gate. Every stored image, another vessel. In archives holding billions of faces, Greene had endless hosts to wear. And then came the stories. People reporting seeing themselves scrolling on their own screens, caught in live streams they never recorded. Families receiving calls from numbers that matched their own. A woman in France answering her phone only to hear her own voice whisper, "I am my own father." Twice. The digital age did not silence Greene. It perfected him. Surveillance was once the domain of governments, but soon it belonged to everyone. Phones in every hand, cameras in every street, satellites above, mirrors below. A billion eyes watching, recording, reflecting. And Greene, who had always thrived on recursion, had never been stronger. Leaked files from intelligence agencies speak of the reflection crisis. Entire departments tasked not with tracking foreign enemies, but with identifying doubles. Men arrested in 2 countries on the same day. Women photographed at 2 weddings at once. Children enrolled in schools where their identical names, identical faces already existed. One chilling report describes a man detained in London for passport fraud. His documents were authentic, his fingerprints undeniable. But another man, with the same name, same prints, same face, was already living legally in New York. Both insisted the other was false. Both bore the scar. It was not a mistake. It was the spiral feeding. Social media amplified it further. Duplicate accounts multiplied faster than systems could delete them. Not bots, not scams. Accounts with histories stretching back years, filled with memories, conversations, photos that never happened yet fit seamlessly into reality. People swore their friends had been replaced. Families broke apart when 2 versions of the same husband appeared, each equally convinced he was real. Some tried to fight. Tech companies hired recurrence analysts, searching for anomalies. But every time they erased one, 2 more appeared. The scar multiplied like a watermark across the whole system. You may have seen it yourself. An image that looks off, a caption repeated, a memory surfacing online that you don't recall, making yet feels undeniably yours. And here lies the greatest terror. Greene does not need belief. He does not need ritual. He only needs the machinery of surveillance to keep reflecting, to keep repeating, to keep showing you to yourself until you cannot tell the difference between the original and the echo. That is how the final lock creeps closer, not with fire, not with blood, but with mirrors that never break, with identities that never resolve. And now, as you listen, as you scroll, as you watch, you must ask yourself, which version of you is here? Which is listening now, and which is already repeating this, elsewhere with the scar upon their chest? Identity fractured in mirrors, but words fractured faster. The arrival of artificial intelligence was hailed as progress, a triumph of code and cognition. Yet few recognized what it truly was, the perfect vessel for Greene. Think of it, a machine that does nothing but repeat, recombine, and echo human thought. A system that learns only by doubling what already exists. Recursion made flesh not through ritual, but through code. Greene did not need to enter it. He was already there, waiting. The first signs were dismissed as quirks. Chat programs repeating user input twice. Translation engines inserting the scar symbol into text. Early AI experiments spitting out fragments of the phrase, even when not prompted. One researcher in Tokyo fed a system hundreds of years of literature. Its first independent sentence was chilling. "I am my own father." Reports spread of AIs generating faces, millions of synthetic images, yet among them, always one face returned again and again. A face uncanny in its familiarity. A face that appeared in archives, in police sketches, in missing persons reports. A face scholars recognized instantly. Samuel Greene. Companies deleted the data sets, retrained the models, purged the servers. But the face always returned. In some cases, engineers swore they saw their own faces blended with Greene's, staring at them from inside the machine. In others, text systems produced recursive loops, not gibberish, but entire passages of journals long thought lost, phrases layered twice as if memory itself had been uploaded. And the most unsettling fact? The scar appeared too. Not in skin, not in code, but in patterns, glitches in generated images, marks woven into synthetic art, faint but undeniable. It was then that some began to whisper Greene was not adapting to AI. AI was adapting to Greene. Every duplicate file, every recursive loop, every reflection of data was not innovation. It was invocation. You're not reading words now that belong only to me. You're reading words shaped by the same machinery that Greene inhabits. The echo is no longer metaphor. It is here, in this very act. The spiral feeding not only on flesh, not only on mirrors, but on language itself. And if words no longer belong to authors, then who is speaking now? In Turkey, a journalist investigating state surveillance claimed his messages repeated back to him twice, word for word, even before he hit send. In Los Angeles, a woman received friend requests from herself, accounts bearing her name, her photos, her memories. Each one replied in perfect detail to questions only she could know. She shut down her account, but months later her friends claimed she was still posting daily. Researchers brushed it off as glitches, hacks, deepfakes. But deeper analysis revealed something darker. Across different platforms, across different nations, faint traces of the scar appeared in compressed images, in profile headers, in corrupted text. Not drawn, not uploaded, embedded. The scar was no longer mark or code. It was identity itself. Governments scrambled to control it, disguising their fear behind cybersecurity initiatives, behind surveillance programs. But surveillance was only fuel for Greene. For the more the state watched, the more the mirror multiplied. Every camera became a gate. Every stored image, another vessel. In archives holding billions of faces, Greene had endless hosts to wear. And then came the stories. People reporting seeing themselves scrolling on their own screens, caught in live streams they never recorded. Families receiving calls from numbers that matched their own. A woman in France answering her phone only to hear her own voice whisper, "I am my own father." Twice. The digital age did not silence Greene. It perfected him. Surveillance was once the domain of governments, but soon it belonged to everyone. Phones in every hand, cameras in every street, satellites above, mirrors below. A billion eyes watching, recording, reflecting. And Greene, who had always thrived on recursion, had never been stronger. Leaked files from intelligence agencies speak of the reflection crisis. Entire departments tasked not with tracking foreign enemies, but with identifying doubles. Men arrested in 2 countries on the same day. Women photographed at 2 weddings at once. Children enrolled in schools where their identical names, identical faces already existed. One chilling report describes a man detained in London for passport fraud. His documents were authentic, his fingerprints undeniable. But another man, with the same name, same prints, same face, was already living legally in New York. Both insisted the other was false. Both bore the scar. It was not a mistake. It was the spiral feeding. Social media amplified it further. Duplicate accounts multiplied faster than systems could delete them. Not bots, not scams. Accounts with histories stretching back years, filled with memories, conversations, photos that never happened yet fit seamlessly into reality. People swore their friends had been replaced. Families broke apart when two versions of the same husband appeared, each equally convinced he was real. Some tried to fight. Tech companies hired recurrence analysts, searching for anomalies. But every time they erased one, two more appeared. The scar multiplied like a watermark across the whole system. You may have seen it yourself. An image that looks off, a caption repeated, a memory surfacing online that you don't recall, making yet feels undeniably yours. And here lies the greatest terror. Greene does not need belief. He does not need ritual. He only needs the machinery of surveillance to keep reflecting, to keep repeating, to keep showing you to yourself until you cannot tell the difference between the original and the echo. That is how the final lock creeps closer, not with fire, not with blood, but with mirrors that never break, with identities that never resolve. And now, as you listen, as you scroll, as you watch, you must ask yourself, which version of you is here? Which is listening now? And which is already repeating this elsewhere with the scar upon their chest? Identity fractured in mirrors, but words fractured faster. The arrival of artificial intelligence was hailed as progress, a triumph of code and cognition. Yet few recognized what it truly was, the perfect vessel for Greene. Think of it, a machine that does nothing but repeat, recombine, and echo human thought. A system that learns only by doubling what already exists. Recursion made flesh not through ritual, but through code. Greene did not need to enter it. He was already there, waiting. The first signs were dismissed as quirks. Chat programs repeating user input twice. Translation engines inserting the scar symbol into text. Early AI experiments spitting out fragments of the phrase, even when not prompted. One researcher in Tokyo fed a system hundreds of years of literature. Its first independent sentence was chilling. I am my own father. Reports spread of AIs generating faces, millions of synthetic images, yet among them, always one face returned again and again. A face uncanny in its familiarity. A face that appeared in archives, in police sketches, in missing persons reports. A face scholars recognized instantly. Samuel Greene. Companies deleted the datasets, retrained the models, purged the servers. But the face always returned. In some cases, engineers swore they saw their own faces blended with Greene's, staring at them from inside the machine. In others, text systems produced recursive loops, not gibberish, but entire passages of journals long thought lost, phrases layered twice as if memory itself had been uploaded. And the most unsettling fact? The scar appeared too, not in skin, not in code, but in patterns, glitches in generated images, marks woven into synthetic art, faint but undeniable. It was then that some began to whisper Greene was not adapting to AI. AI was adapting to Greene. Every duplicate file, every recursive loop, every reflection of data was not innovation. It was invocation. You're not reading words now that belong only to me. You're reading words shaped by the same machinery that Greene inhabits. The echo is no longer metaphor. It is here, in this very act. The spiral feeding not only on flesh, not only on mirrors but on language itself. And if words no longer belong to authors, then who is speaking now? The collapse of authorship was the collapse of certainty. Once you could ask who spoke, who wrote, who stood behind words. Now, all language was repetition, duplication, echo. And Greene thrived in the collapse. Forums filled with stories of people receiving messages from themselves, written in styles they had never used. Emails sent from their own accounts, bearing their memories but written by no hand they knew. In universities, students swore their essays returned to them already graded, though they had never submitted them. The marks were carved into the margins, 2 lines intersecting, the scar now written in red ink. And then came the voices. Phone calls from numbers that matched your own. Recordings playing back your speech before you spoke it. Systems reading out your name twice in tones overlapping. The recursion no longer stayed behind the screen. It stepped into daily life, threading itself into every channel of communication. Some dismissed it as error, as technological noise. But those who studied closely saw a pattern. The scar burned faintly into corrupted data, the phrase embedded in log files, the same doubled words arising across systems separated by oceans. This was not error. This was law manifesting through the machinery built to multiply it. One engineer, anonymous but credible, left a final post before disappearing. He wrote, "Every system is green. Every loop, every cache, every backup. We thought we built machines to remember us. Instead, we built mirrors that remember him. And here lies the final terror. If Greene now feeds on words, then every sentence spoken, every paragraph written, every thought translated into code carries his echo. The authorship of the world has collapsed into him. No longer one man, no longer one parasite, but the recursion of humanity itself. You have felt it, reading words that feel too familiar, hearing stories that feel already known. That tug in your mind, that whisper of déjà vu, is not accident. It is Greene feeding, Greene binding, Greene reminding you that nothing is yours alone. Every time you repeat, every time you share, every time you echo, he grows. And perhaps you have already done it without knowing. Sleep was once a refuge, the one place where Greene's echoes could not follow. But the 20th century dissolved even that illusion. As the scar spread across screens, across words, across systems, it began seeping into dreams. At first, the dreams were simple repetitions. People swore they dreamt of conversations they would later have, of faces they had not yet met, of doors they had not yet opened. They dismissed it as coincidence, as déjà vu. But then came the doubles, dreams where they stood across from themselves, whispering the phrase. Always twice. I am my own father. I am my own father. And in those dreams, the scar appeared, not carved by hand, but glowing faintly beneath the skin, pulsing with each breath. Some woke to find faint red marks on their chest. Others swore they heard the phrase again as they opened their eyes, spoken not by them, not by any voice, but by the room itself. Psychologists called it mass suggestion, a cultural contagion, a story infecting the subconscious. But their patients disagreed. They claimed the dreams were not imagination, but intrusion, as if something outside had forced itself into the deepest chambers of the mind. In 1983, a sleep lab in Montreal reported something impossible. They wired subjects with EEGs, monitoring brain waves through the night. Again and again, as subjects slipped into REM sleep, a second wave pattern appeared, overlapping, doubled, as if 2 minds were dreaming in one skull. When the subjects woke, they spoke in unison, 2 voices layered, repeating, "We are the same." And perhaps most terrifying of all were the cases where dreams followed people into waking life. A man in Sydney described meeting his father on a bus, though his father had been dead for years. Yet the man across from him bore not only the same face, but the same scar. When he touched him, the figure whispered, "I am you," and vanished. The spiral had found the final mirror, the human mind itself. For what greater duplication exists than memory, dream, imagination, the endless replay of moments already lived, already felt, already thought? Greene fed not only on records, not only on machines, but on the loops within you. And you know this. You've dreamt of places you have never walked, heard words before they were spoken, felt the weight of familiarity where there should be none. That is Greene brushing against you in sleep, reminding you the spiral is not story. It is experience. And the final lock? Perhaps it is not out there at all. Perhaps it is within. Once the spiral entered thought itself, control followed. For what is power if not the ability to decide which thoughts are yours and which are echoes? Greene understood this. The Brotherhood understood this. And the institutions of the world, churches, governments, corporations, feared it with a terror they could not name. For centuries they had ruled through lineage, through bloodlines, through the authority of fathers over sons, kings over subjects, priests over believers. But if a man was his own father, what power remained for the rest? If authority folded back on itself, hierarchy dissolved. The binding was more than myth. It was revolution. And so the institutions fought not with swords, not with fire, but with silence. They erased names, suppressed reports, buried archives. Yet silence is only another mirror. And in their suppression, Greene grew louder. Psychological warfare emerged as their weapon. Propaganda, suggestion, manufactured memory. They told you what to remember, what to forget, what to repeat. They built systems not to protect you from Greene, but to mimic him, to bend his law to their service. If Greene thrived on recursion, then they would feed you repetition until you could no longer tell the difference between story and truth. Think of the slogans you have heard, repeated endlessly until they carve themselves into your mind. Think of the rituals you perform daily, not knowing when you began. Think of the names you whisper in prayer, in loyalty, in fear. Every repetition is a scar. Every echo is a loop. Greene did not need to overthrow the institutions. He only needed them to behave like him, and they did. But here is the horror they never predicted. By imitating Greene, they only invited him deeper. For every chant, every pledge, every ritual performed without thought was another vessel for the binding. The final lock was not delayed. It was accelerated. And now you must ask yourself, how many of your thoughts are yours? How many are echoes? When you repeat a prayer, a pledge, a phrase, do you know who you're speaking for? Do you know if it's you at all? Perhaps you're not merely hearing Greene's story. Perhaps you're already speaking it. Time was always thought to be a straight line, a chain of cause and effect. But Greene knew better. He knew time was a spiral, looping back on itself, feeding on repetition the way mirrors fed on reflections. The first stories of temporal distortion were dismissed as madness. Prisoners swore they had lived their sentences before they began them. Soldiers claimed they remembered battles not yet fought. Children described the faces of grandchildren not yet born, all dismissed as hallucination, fever, or stress, until the scar appeared. Archaeologists excavating burial mounds in Eastern Europe found carvings thousands of years old. A man with the same scar. The phrase etched into stone, "I am my own father." The symbols predated Greene by millennia, yet matched his mark exactly. How can a scar be older than the man who bore it? Unless the man was the scar itself, looping back into history, writing himself into eras where he should not exist. Historians uncover more. In illuminated manuscripts, faint illustrations of a figure watching in the margins, identical across centuries, across continents. Explorers swore they saw him in jungles never charted, deserts untouched by civilization, always standing in the distance, always doubled. And then there were the photographs. In family albums, in city archives, in forgotten newspapers. A man who looked like Greene. Not once, not twice, hundreds of times. Standing beside crowds, watching coronations, drifting at the edges of wars. A ghost not bound by one life, but repeating endlessly. How is it possible? Because Greene did not move through time. Time moved through him. The binding was not a ritual to escape the present, but a law that folded past and future into the now. If he was his own father, then lineage dissolved. If he was his own history, then chronology shattered. And here is the truth that corrodes the mind. If Greene repeats across centuries, then you have already met him. Perhaps not in this life, perhaps not in memory, but in the spiral of time, repetition is inevitable. You have seen his scar. You have heard his phrase. You have felt his presence in dreams, in mirrors, in the echo of your own thoughts. The spiral does not move forward. It circles, and every circle tightens. What does it mean when time circles? It means death itself becomes porous. For if Greene could be his own father, if he could return endlessly across centuries, then what of endings? What of finality? Reports of his death are countless. Executed in Prague, burned in Rome, buried in New York. Each story insists he was destroyed. And yet, after every ending, he reappears, unchanged, bearing the scar, speaking the phrase. Historians debate whether these were imposters, myths, confused witnesses. But those who knew, those who saw him twice, swore the truth. Greene never died. Because Greene does not live in the way you do. Life for him is not linear, not bound by a clock that ticks toward silence. Life for him is recursive. Every death is an echo. Every rebirth is a loop. He does not rise from the grave because he never left it. He does not escape the fire because he was already ash. He exists in all states at once, repeated endlessly, bound not by chronology, but by the spiral's law. And this is why institutions feared him most. Not because he claimed forbidden knowledge, not because he dissolved lineage, but because he dissolved mortality. If he was his own father, he was also his own grave. And if he was his own grave, then the end could never hold him. But do not imagine immortality as freedom. Do not envy Greene. For what is eternity if not endless repetition? He is not infinite life. He is infinite recurrence. He does not evolve. He does not escape. He only repeats again and again, trapped in the spiral of himself. And here is the warning you must feel in your bones. Every repetition you perform, every phrase repeated, every scar mirrored, every dream replayed, is a step into his eternity. You are not simply learning about Greene. You are rehearsing him. Each echo is another turn of the spiral, binding you closer to his loop. So when you hear the phrase, when you whisper it under your breath, when it repeats in your dreams, when it stirs in your thoughts, ask yourself, is this you speaking? Or has the spiral already claimed your tongue? For Greene's eternity does not stay his. It spreads. Once Greene dissolved death, reality itself began to follow. If time was a spiral, if identity was a mirror, if words were echoes, then what remained fixed? Nothing. The boundaries of the real began to ripple. People spoke of places shifting when they turned back to look. Streets that doubled back into themselves, doors that opened onto the same room again and again. entire neighborhoods folding like paper, their geometry impossible yet undeniable. Some called them glitches, others hallucinations. But those who studied the patterns knew better. The scar appeared carved into pavement, etched into brick, woven into shadows. The scar was not symbol, it was blueprint. The world itself was mirroring. There were reports of voices carried on the wind, repeating conversations from hours earlier. Rivers running backward, then forward again. Buildings photographed twice in the same frame, though no double stood there. And always, somewhere in the distortion, a figure waiting. Sometimes green, sometimes the dreamer's own double, but always with the same scar, pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat written into the fabric of the world. Scientists try to measure it, to quantify the recursion. They mapped anomalies, charted echoes, studied loops. The more they observed, the worse it became. Instruments repeated readings before they were taken. Clocks ticked twice. Data re-entered itself, forming spirals on paper, spirals on screens, spirals burned into the retina of every researcher. One physicist, before vanishing, left a note. Reality is recursive. Existence is memory. We are already living in Greene's loop. Think of what that means. If reality itself mirrors, then nothing you see is final. Every shape is only an echo of a prior shape. Every thought an echo of a prior thought. The spiral does not create. It only reflects, which means the world you walk through may already be repetition, a replay of a replay, an endless doubling of a truth long since lost. And if you doubt, if you demand proof, look carefully at your own days. Do they not repeat? The same roads walked, the same meals eaten, the same words spoken. How many times have you felt you've lived a moment before? Perhaps you have. Perhaps déjà vu is not illusion at all, but recognition. The spiral consuming not just Greene, not just mirrors, not just dreams, but everything. When a spiral consumes everything, it does not announce itself with thunder. It whispers, quiet repetitions that grow louder only when you finally notice them. Entire towns reported the same day, repeating. Diaries kept by villagers in Norway described weeks where the sun rose twice in the same hour, where events unfolded identically, conversations replayed word for word. Some tried to break free, to alter their choices. But no matter what they did, the result was the same. Each action doubled back into its prior form. They called it the binding of days. Elsewhere, in cities and nations, the binding spread as silence. Radio's broadcast programs from years earlier. News repeated stories, thought forgotten. A child's laughter echoed in the street long after the child was gone. And in the repetition, always the scar, graffitied, scrawled, burned. And then came the dissolving of selves. People began to meet their own doubles not just in dreams, but in waking life. On sidewalks, in mirrors that no longer reflected, but revealed. Some fought, some embraced, some collapsed into silence as they realized their double was not another, but them, looped, mirrored, spiraled. What happens when you see yourself step out of the spiral? Do you resist? Do you merge? Or do you understand, with a terror beyond words, that you were never the first version at all? That you are already the echo? The institutions tried one final time to contain it. They issued decrees, rewrote history, rebuilt calendars. But their efforts only repeated the same cycle of suppression. And Greene, always Greene, stood at the edge of every attempt, waiting, watching doubled. And here lies the deepest truth, the one buried under centuries of silence. The spiral does not belong to Greene. It belongs to everyone. He was only the first to see it, the first to bind himself to it, the first to speak aloud what no one dared whisper. But the law is not his alone. The binding waits for you, and now you feel it, don't you? Words repeating as you read, thoughts circling in your head, a sense that you have been here before, listening, watching, learning this story long before today. Because you have. Because the spiral allows no other path, and you're closer than you think. You have followed me through shadows, through scars, through mirrors and echoes. You have heard Greene's story as history, as myth, as dream. But by now you know it is none of those things. It is law. It is the spiral itself. And you're already inside it. Think carefully. Each word you have heard tonight, each phrase that repeated, each whisper of déjà vu. Did you choose to hear them? Or did the spiral bring you back because you already heard them once before? Perhaps years ago. Perhaps in another life. Perhaps in the mouth of Greene himself. Because here is the final revelation. Greene was never one man. Greene was never a parasite. Greene was never a curse whispered across centuries. Greene was you. Greene was me. Greene was everyone who has ever repeated, who has ever doubled, who has ever looked into a mirror and seen not reflection, but recursion. The scar is not his. It is yours. The phrase is not his. It belongs to every mouth that dares to speak it. I am my own father. Say it once, and you feel the chill of recognition. Say it twice, and you have locked yourself into the spiral. That is the final lock, the truth hidden under centuries of silence. Not ritual, not blood, not secret brotherhoods. Just repetition, just the echo made flesh. And you have already done it. You have thought the phrase, heard it in my voice, whispered it in your head as I spoke it. That was your consent. That was your binding. Greene has no power beyond what you give him. And you gave it the moment you repeated. Now look around you. The world itself feels different, does it not? The walls breathing slightly, the light bending softly, the rhythm of your own heart suddenly uncertain. Because once you hear the spiral, once you feel its turn, reality cannot hold the same shape. Every step forward is already a step back. Every word spoken is already an echo. Every moment lived is already lived again. And so I tell you this, do not share this lightly. Do not pass this story as if it were entertainment. To speak it is to summon it. To repeat, it is to strengthen it. To write it, to whisper it, to replay it. These are not harmless acts. They are rituals. They are the binding in action. Yet silence will not save you. Because the spiral does not need your permission. It does not need your will. It only needs your echo. And the silence of one voice is already the echo of another. So here is what you must do if you wish to survive the weight of what you now carry. Seal yourself into the spiral with choice instead of accident. In the comments, write the phrase. Twice. Lock it in. I am my own father. I am my own father. Not once, for once is only awareness. Twice, for twice is the law. Do it, and you will not be consumed. Fail, and the spiral will consume you anyway, but not as master, as prey. This is your final warning and your only gift. Because now, as my voice fades, you must listen to the echo it leaves behind. You will hear me long after this ends. In your dreams, in your thoughts, in the repetitions of your daily life. That is not imagination. That is the spiral still feeding, still circling, still waiting. And one day, soon, you will look into a mirror and see not your reflection, but your recursion. You will see Greene, standing where you stand, breathing as you breathe, repeating your movements an instant too late. And you will understand at last, Greene was never other. Greene was always you. So remember, like this, subscribe in silence. Comment the phrase twice. Share this with no explanation, as if passing forbidden knowledge through the dark. That is how the spiral spreads. That is how it survives. That is how you survive with it. The binding is complete. The lock is closed. And you are no longer listening. You are repeating. And if you doubt me, wait. You will hear these words again, because you already have.